I'm Alex de Fircks. My grandparents were Olga and Paul Woronoff. I have been interested in my family history for many years now, and I have a blog which is freely accessible, which delves into different stories from both sides of my family history. And recently I've republished my grandmother's book Upheaval, so there's a second edition out which has more photos, more information, her diary and letters. So my grandmother was Olga Woronoff. She was born Countess Olga Konstantinova Kleinmichael. Kleinmichael is quite a well-known family, still in Russia today, for various reasons. So she was born into quite a privileged family, and she married my grandfather, who was a lieutenant on the Tsar's Imperial yacht. I always knew that she'd written Upheaval, and I read it as a teenager, but I'd never quite equated it with members of my own family. It was like reading about characters in a book. And she did tell me some of the stories that are in Upheaval, and I thought they were kind of cute and nice, and it was just the stories that your grandmother might tell you. As I got older, I didn't pay much attention, and she was just a very elderly, frail lady who eventually disappeared into Alzheimer's. But I loved her very much. We always got on. She was always on my side in any arguments I had with my parents and that. She was lovely, absolutely lovely, and always a lady. She always treated people very politely. It wasn't until later on, after she died, and I was an adult, that I reread Upheaval and thought, whoa, this is actually an amazing story, and an amazing one to have in your family. But it really wasn't until after my father died that I found all the documents that they'd kept, which really triggered my curiosity to find out more about them and what they went through. It was a very long, slow process which took me years. I literally started from page 1 and read through Upheaval, and every time I came to something that I questioned, for example, the architect of Evnia, which turned out not to be the architect my grandmother wrote about. But that would send me to research who really was the architect, when it was really built, what style it was built in. And so I progressed through Upheaval that way. I'd read a paragraph and there'd be another question and I'd be like, really? And then I would, use all the resources that I had at hand, whether it was old documents or Google or Russian Google, or especially my researcher friend in Russia, to find out what the truth was. There were quite a few things that my grandmother got wrong. I hate to say got wrong, because she was obviously told one thing or the other and believed it. Like when you're told, okay, so your grandfather was an important person who was loved by the Russian people, you believe it. Now I know that he wasn't. He was actually not a very nice person on the Kleinmichael side. I think this is the difference, where what she's writing is from her heart and from her memories and things that she was told, at least about her early life, whereas I've tried to discover the truth behind this. And when she talks about the war years, and especially the time in when my grandfather fought in the First World War and in the volunteer army, the White Army, it wasn't so much correcting her as trying to fill out the information. So if she talked, for example, about a certain general, I would try to find out the information about that general and find out who exactly he was. So little things like that. With the correspondence, Helen Azar, who wrote the foreword for the new edition of Upheaval, had published several books on the correspondence and the diaries of the Grand Duchesses. And there's another author, George Hawkins, from New Zealand, who's also translated their correspondence. And they both published bits and pieces of the letters, but they had been given, I believe they had all the letters, but they just used the ones that were important to their books. There's also a lady in USA who was an ex-student of my grandmother's, who had copies of all of the letters that between my grandmother and the Grand Duchesses. And I've corresponded with her a bit as well. So I really wanted to use this correspondence because I thought it gave a little bit more of a better understanding of the friendship between my grandmother and the Grand Duchesses. So much focus has been on my grandfather with Grand Duchess Olga, not very much on her relationship with them. So obviously I wanted to use the letters, and I didn't know who to approach, and eventually discovered that they were held in Garf in Russia, which is the state archives. So I corresponded with them, and they gave me permission to use the letters as long as they got a copy of the book Upheaval, which is shortly on its way to them. With the diary, I found the diary in the documents that I had inherited, and I didn't know it was a diary to start off with. I scanned the pages and sent them to the lady who's done my translation for me, and discovered it was the diary from 1919, and that was an amazing discovery. That was absolutely fantastic because I think it gives much more of a more rounded idea of what my grandparents were going through in that last year. I think one of the most fascinating things for me was finding documents, particularly about my grandfather and his time during all of the conflicts. I had absolutely no idea that he had suffered from what was then called shell shock and what we would call PTSD. I didn't know that he had anemia. I didn't know that he had a number of different illnesses. But it kind of explains how sick he was before he died, and when I was still quite young, and perhaps why he didn't live as long as my grandmother did. So it was really interesting to find the actual certificates that listed his illnesses and his injuries, and which led me into looking more into his war in World War I and what had happened. And that was really eye-opening to find out where he was and what they had to go through. I think also having his medals is fantastic, and I've had a little bit of research done on them. I would like to know more about them. The research that I had done, it was suggested that I have to have a look for more of the insignias or engravings just to see if they are actually the ones that were given at X time or X time, just to narrow it down a bit better. So I still have a lot of research to do. I still have a lot of translation to do. And I think one of the most exciting things is also being able to work on the sequel to Upheaval and to tell the story of what happened to them after they left Russia, which I don't think that many people from their walk of life have written about. So there are quite a few memoirs from the aristocracy who still kept a lot of their fortune and didn't have to go out to work. And there are a few memoirs from people who were not nobility, but I don't know of any from around the same sort of family situation as my grandparents.